Hey everyone, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. Welcome back everyone to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. The topic for today's episode is some updated and emerging research surrounding low carbohydrate, high fat diets for endurance athletes, as well as the effect of these types of diets on endurance athletes' performance. So I've read quite a bit of research over the years on this specific topic, and I've written quite a bit about it, and I've done a couple posts on my online forum related to this topic of low carbohydrate, high fat diets for endurance athletes. And I'll be sure to link those written posts into the show notes so that you can read into low carbohydrate, high fat diets in greater depth and detail, as I tend to go in greater depth and detail in some of my written posts compared to my podcast. But the point of this podcast is not to necessarily provide a comprehensive overview of low carbohydrate, high fat diets and all the research that's been done previously, as well as some of the proposed mechanisms behind it. The point of this podcast is to provide a little bit more of a brief update on some of the latest research that I've come across surrounding this topic. So if you want, or I would encourage you actually to start by reading the written posts that I'll link into the show notes so that you can have a greater understanding of some of the proposed mechanisms behind the low carbohydrate, high fat diets, as well as some of the older research from back in the 1980s and 1990s that kind of got this whole topic sparked for endurance athletes and coaches working with endurance athletes. Because most of this research surrounding low carbohydrate, high fat diets started back in the 1980s. And in particular in a specific study in 1983 in which a researcher, Dr. Finney, and his colleagues were the first ones that actually tested the impact of a low carbohydrate, high fat diet on endurance athletes. They found some relatively promising results, although if my memory serves me correctly, it was a very, very small sample size. It was like 5 or 6 cyclists that they had in this study, and they had, I think, half the sample see some improvements when on a low carb, high fat diet, and then the other half saw some decrements in their performance. But based on this research, it kind of sparked a little bit of interest in this topic, and it's taken off a little bit since 1983 when this first study was done. Now, most of the studies that have been done to date on this topic have shown that low carbohydrate, high fat diets tend to have a negative effect on performance in endurance athletes across the board. It doesn't really matter which marker of performance that you're measuring. It tends to, for most endurance athletes, have a negative effect on their performance, as well as a variety of other negative effects. But researchers continue to look at it, and they continue to look at like different breakdowns of low carbohydrate, high fat diets. So when it comes to low carbohydrate, high fat diets, there's like the more classic version, I guess I would say, of low carbohydrate, high fat diets. And typically these type of diets will consist of greater than 60% of calories from fat, less than 25% of calories from carbohydrates, and then the remaining 10, 15, 20% from protein. And this is compared to what is currently recommended by most sports governing organizations and research-related organizations, which is kind of the standard higher carbohydrate, lower fat diet for endurance athletes. And that diet is typically about 50 to 60% of energy intake from carbohydrates, 15 to 20% from protein, and then about 20 to 35% from fat. So about the opposite of what the kind of classic low carbohydrate, high fat diet is. But there's been kind of a subset of researchers that have focused less on the kind of classic low carbohydrate, high fat diet design and more on a ketogenic low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which is kind of a more extreme version of the quote unquote classic version of the low carb diet. And typically these type of diets consist of less than 5% of energy or calorie intake from carbohydrates, and then the rest is from protein and fat. Protein and fat. So That's a pretty small amount of daily carbohydrate intake, and usually for most people, like 5% of their daily caloric intake from carbohydrates would be the equivalent of like a banana and an apple or something, or like a couple pieces of fruit. So it's not a lot of carbohydrate. And so it's quite an extreme version of a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. But there are some potential proposed mechanisms as to why it might be beneficial for endurance athletes to get into a ketogenic state. Some of these proposed benefits kind of overlap with some of the proposed benefits of just the more standard low carbohydrate, high fat diet. But nonetheless, researchers over the past 3 decades or so have focused their research on either that classic low carbohydrate, high fat diet design, or more of the ketogenic low carbohydrate, high fat diet design. And in this particular podcast, most of the research that I reviewed that was published recently or more recently tends to focus more on the ketogenic version of this low carbohydrate diet. And so just keep that in mind as I'm discussing this research, as some of the research that's been done in the past was utilizing more of that kind of classic, less extreme version of the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. But most research over recent years has kind of shifted towards looking at a ketogenic version of a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And so back when I originally did more of like a comprehensive review of the low carbohydrate, high fat diet literature for endurance athletes, I came up with 3 main conclusions that I took away from this research. So number 1 was that low carbohydrate, high fat diets didn't really have any evidence to document their superiority to the more traditional high carbohydrate, low fat diet that is currently recommended for endurance athletes. And so this is important because if you're going to make a dramatic shift in anything you do as an athlete, you want that change that you make to be more beneficial than what you were doing before. So if we're shifting athletes away from what's currently recommended in a high carbohydrate diet to a low carbohydrate diet, you would, for the most part, want that low carbohydrate diet to have more positives than negatives, or at least be more beneficial than the high carbohydrate diet that the athlete was consuming previously. But with the research that's been published, we don't really have evidence to support that. Most research studies that have been published on low carbohydrate, high fat diets tend to show that performance decreases in endurance athletes. There tends to be a very, very small subsample of endurance athletes that see some level of improvement or positive change, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit later in more detail. But for the most part, the vast majority of endurance athletes do not respond particularly well to a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. Number 2, the second takeaway was that low carbohydrate, high fat diets impair the ability of endurance athletes to do high intensity work. Now, one of the main theories behind why a low carbohydrate, high fat diet is so beneficial for endurance athletes is because it essentially allows endurance athletes to rely more on fat oxidation during exercise as opposed to glucose oxidation, or the utilization of sugar to provide energy. And every single endurance athlete, even if you have a really low body fat percentage, has a almost an endless amount of fat reserve to draw upon, especially for like a one-day event. Even something like an Ironman, you're never going to run out of fat stores doing an Ironman. And so that's one of the theories as to why this type of diet might be so beneficial, is because it allows the athlete to shift their energy metabolism to more of a fat oxidation state during training and racing in particular, as opposed to relying on glucose, which tends to run out. Glucose and glycogen stores can be emptied, especially during longer races, if it's not replaced during the training session or during the race. But at the same time, endurance athletes also need to have the capacity to work intensely in training and in racing, even in long distance events like half Ironmans or Ironmans or marathons or ultra marathons. Especially more competitive athletes. Typically, they're not racing below the threshold of when maximal fat oxidation occurs. which for most athletes tends to be somewhere around like 60 to 65% of VO2 max. Any reasonably competitive athlete that's running a marathon is likely running well above that intensity. And even if you go on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, some athletes can raise their ceiling at which they're maximally oxidizing fat. But even still, most competitive athletes are going to be exercising at an intensity that is higher than the percentage of their VO2 max at which maximal fat oxidation occurs. And so they're going to have to rely on some glucose and glycogen stores for energy. But the problem with being on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet that we see in the research literature and just anecdotally is that it significantly impairs most athletes' ability to do high intensity work. And so this is a big issue in training and in racing, because in training, even athletes that are focusing on like ultra extreme distance endurance events still do some level of high intensity work. And it seems that low carbohydrate diets will impair the ability to do quality high intensity work. And then in racing as well, even long distance events, there still might be brief bouts of high intensity effort. So for example, let's say you're doing an Ironman, even on like an Ironman bike course, let's say there's a big hill on like a 2 or 3 loop bike course that you have to do, and you have to do it 2 or 3 times over the course of that bike course. And let's just say it's too steep of a hill for you to keep the effort really, really low, and you kind of start to dip into some higher intensity efforts when you're going up that hill. That's where a lower carbohydrate, high fat diet might end up kind of showing some of its negatives in that race scenario, is if it's keeping you from working at a higher intensity to get over that hill, and it's causing an unnecessary amount of fatigue when you have to dip into some higher intensity energy reserves. And so low carbohydrate, high fat diets tend to impair the ability of endurance athletes to do high intensity work. And then the third takeaway is that there was some possibility of a low carbohydrate, high fat diet to improve performance in ultra endurance athletes. But this is really only and this is just kind of a theoretical scenario. There isn't a lot of research that's been done on ultra endurance athletes. Some research that's been done on long distance triathletes, but very, very little that's been done on like multi-day extreme endurance events and athletes that partake in those events. But for those types of events where athletes are literally like hiking or walking or like riding their bike at an unbelievably low intensity, there is the possibility that improving their capacity to oxidize fat and then therefore spare themselves of utilizing all of their glycogen stores, that could potentially be beneficial. Because one issue with ultra endurance events is that at some point you will potentially run out of glycogen stores and kind of have that dreaded bonk sensation. Even if you're replacing all of your, or if you're taking in exogenous forms of carbohydrates during an event, for something that's really extreme, like multi-day or like week-long or multi-week-long events, there is a very real risk of kind of running out of glycogen stores. And so there could be a potential possibility of a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet working in favor for some of those ultra-endurance athletes, but only athletes that are training and racing at like extremely low intensities. Because again, low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets, we know impair an endurance athlete's ability to do high-intensity work. And so as soon as you start to go into some of those higher intensities, that's where the downsides of that diet will start to show up for the athlete. So those are 3 of the main takeaways that I got when I looked at, when I took a more comprehensive look at the research literature on this topic. But that was back in like 2017 or 2016 when I looked at this research literature. And so obviously, that being 5 or 6 years ago now, I wanted to do a little bit of an updated look into some of the research that's been published recently. Now, more recently, most of the research has been focused more on ketogenic versions of a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. So again, that's what most of what I discuss from here on is going to be focused on, is research surrounding ketogenic versions of this diet. And one of the first papers I found was a pretty good systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in 2021. And essentially, they were looking at all of the research studies that have been done to date that have examined the effects of a ketogenic version of low carbohydrate diets on endurance athletes. And so they ended up including a total of 10 individual studies in this analysis that included about 140 endurance athletes. And the outcomes that they were primarily looking at were aerobic capacity, so that's VO2 max as assessed by like the gold standard graded exercise test, time to exhaustion on a graded exercise test, so essentially like how long the athlete can last, maximum heart rate that athletes could achieve on that graded exercise test, as well as another metric that's known as respiratory exchange ratio, which essentially is just a measure of glucose or fat oxidation. So those are the main outcomes that they included in their meta-analysis. And essentially, they found that there was no significant positive effect whatsoever with the ketogenic, low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets on aerobic capacity, time to exhaustion, or maximum heart rate. However, there was a large shift towards greater fat metabolism, as evidenced by a large decrease in respiratory exchange ratio. So an increased respiratory exchange ratio means greater glucose metabolism, and then a decreased respiratory exchange ratio means greater fat oxidation or fat metabolism during exercise. All right. And so in general, these findings tend to be very similar to what the overall larger body of low carbohydrate, high fat diet research literature shows, which is that there really isn't any kind of superiority of a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, whether it's ketogenic or not, on improving performance variables or physiological characteristics of endurance athletes. Now, this meta-analysis did only look at physiological characteristics for the most part as assessed in a lab on a graded exercise test. But we have research studies too, and I'll get into one in particular here in a second, that shows even out in the real world during real world performances in competition, there tends to be a decrease in performance or no change in performance whatsoever for the vast majority of endurance athletes. So this meta-analysis just kind of confirmed what was already out there in the research literature. So again, didn't really change the takeaways that I have from the research literature on low carbohydrate, high fat diets. And then just to give an example of like an individual study that included some high performance athletes, and within the study they included real world performance assessments. There was a recently published study by Burke and colleagues, and I believe this was published in 2022. And the overall design of this study was rather complex, but essentially the researchers in this study took 13 Olympic level race walkers. Sorry, some of them were Olympic level, but all of them were professional race walkers, which is actually relatively common for a lot of these low carbohydrate, high fat diet studies to be done in elite race walkers. So Burke and colleagues tend to do a lot of their work with elite race walkers out of Australia. And so for this study, they included more elite or professional race walkers. There were 13 of them, and essentially there were 3 different phases to this research study. So in phase 1, all 13 athletes completed a baseline fitness and performance test. So they got their VO2 max assessed in the lab. They did a walking economy test, so essentially seeing like how efficient they were while they were walking at their goal race pace. And then they did a real world 10,000 meter performance or competition on a track. So this was like an actual set up competition. It wasn't anything that was done in a lab. So kind of more of a real world example of a performance outcome. And after they did the baseline test, this was followed by a typical 5-day high carbohydrate, low fat diet, just to establish a baseline dietary intake. And then they completed this first phase with a 25-kilometer long walk. So just kind of going out for their like standard long walk for the week, where they were recording things such as respiratory exchange ratio, heart rate, perceived exertion, etc. In phase 2, these athletes were then divided into a high carbohydrate, low fat diet group or a ketogenic, low carbohydrate, high fat diet group for 5 days. And then this was followed up by a repeat of baseline fitness and performance measures. And then they also did another one of their 25-kilometer long walks. And then for phase 3, all athletes went back to what they call the high carbohydrate, low fat diet restoration phase or diet for 5 days. and then they again repeated all of these performance measures again at the end of phase 3. I think the only thing they didn't do was another 10,000 meter race on the track. So essentially the reason for this design was they wanted to see, get kind of like a baseline assessment of where athletes were at when they were consuming their normal habitual high carbohydrate diet, shift them over to a low carbohydrate diet for 5 days to see what the effects of this ketogenic low carbohydrate diet on these athletes were, and then shift them all back to kind of their baseline high carbohydrate diet, and then see what happens again when they kind of go back to their normal diet and what happens after 5 days of doing so. And the results were rather interesting. So I'll just kind of summarize some of the main take-home points from this study. 5 to 6 days of adaptation to a ketogenic diet was a sufficient amount of time to increase exercise fat oxidation rates previously seen with longer-term studies that have been done for more than 12 weeks. So one critique that some of the the low carbohydrate research studies receive is that some of the time frames of the studies are too short to see real improvements and adaptation to a ketogenic or a low carbohydrate diet. But this study showed that just 5 days of adaptation to a ketogenic diet allowed them to achieve exercise fat oxidation rates that were previously seen with study designs that lasted for 12 weeks or longer, which is significant. So it means that essentially 5 to 6 days of adaptation is potentially sufficient to see increases in exercise fat oxidation. Now, this increase in fat oxidation among the athletes that did eventually go into that ketogenic low carbohydrate diet group, this was also seen with a reduction in exercise efficiency. And this was evident with a 5 to 8% increase in oxygen cost at the race walkers' 10,000 meter race performances. So this is rather significant because a 5 to 8% increase, which is a decrease in efficiency, is potentially really, really significant, especially for athletes competing at the elite or Olympic level. And so that is definitely something that you would not want to see in an athlete when they shift from one diet to another. So essentially they were getting less efficient when they were on a ketogenic version of the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And then acute restoration of glycogen stores with a 1 day high carbohydrate refeeding period prior to their 10,000 meter race performance was not enough to outweigh the negative impacts of the ketogenic diet on their performance. So among the athletes that did shift over to the ketogenic version of the diet, prior to their 10,000 meter race, they did have 1 day where they ate a high carbohydrate diet to kind of restore their glycogen stores. But even when they did this, it wasn't enough to outweigh the negative effects of the ketogenic diet on their performance. And then again, we've seen this before in the exercise literature around ketogenic diets and low carbohydrate diets, but high intensity exercise performance was impaired again among athletes that followed the ketogenic diet. And even that acute restoration of glycogen stores for 1 day prior to their performance wasn't enough to improve their high intensity exercise capacity that they were able to achieve at baseline. So those were some of the main takeaways from this study. And basically, the findings of this study kind of fall in line with what we see in the overall larger body of the research literature on this topic of low carbohydrate diets. And so essentially, I walked away from this kind of updated review of the literature on this topic with essentially the same findings, which again, low carbohydrate diets, very minimal evidence to document that they're superior to traditional and currently recommended high carbohydrate, low fat diets. We see this over and over again. Low carbohydrate, high fat diets impair endurance athletes' ability to do high intensity work, which again is extremely important in training and in racing, even for athletes that compete in long distance events. And there's some possibility of low carbohydrate diets to improve performance in ultra endurance athletes that are competing at extremely low intensities. But again, that is still just a theoretical takeaway because there hasn't been a lot of research that's been done on ultra endurance athletes. But then there was one additional takeaway or conclusion that I walked away with when I was doing an updated review of this research literature. And it does seem that there is a very, very small subset of endurance athletes. So like for every 100 endurance athletes, like 2, 3, 4, or 5 athletes that seem to respond somewhat positively to a ketogenic low carbohydrate diet. So even in that study that I was just discussing by Burke and colleagues back in 2022, there was 1 or 2 athletes in that study that tended to show trends for improved performance. And so I find this really interesting and something that we can't really ignore as coaches or researchers in this field, which is that even though 95% of endurance athletes tend to not respond positively to a ketogenic version of a low carbohydrate diet or just a low carbohydrate diet in general, there is a small subset that do respond positively. And so this could come down to just individual genetics of athletes, and some athletes tending to respond a little bit more positively to this type of diet. And so there are coaches out there that do tend to promote a low carbohydrate diet, and they have worked with some elite level athletes to some great successes with these athletes following this diet. And so I think an important thing to consider when we see these types of coaches or these types of athletes is that there are just potentially some athletes out there that will respond positively to this type of diet, whereas the vast majority of athletes are more likely to respond positively to a high carbohydrate diet. There could be some athletes that do perform better on a low carbohydrate version of a diet. And so this was a new conclusion that I walked away with when I looked at this, at some of the updated research, because it's just, there's too many studies where you see like 1 or 2 or 3 people out of the sample respond positively to the diet. And it's just happened enough times now in various research studies that it's difficult to ignore it and just say, nope, ketogenic diets don't work at all for anyone. Well, they might for a small subgroup of endurance athletes, and that's important to keep in mind. Now, I wouldn't necessarily, and I'm not a dietitian, so I don't necessarily recommend specific diets to people or to athletes that I work with, but in general, as like a blanket statement, I would say that most athletes should probably be on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, as that's what the evidence tends to suggest is the most superior diet for endurance athletes. But there are, again, some athletes out there that might respond better to a ketogenic version of, or just a low carbohydrate diet in general. And the only way you're really going to know is by testing it out. And so, for example, I myself tested out a low carbohydrate diet in the past, and I did it for about a month. Didn't respond very well to it, and so I just went back to my normal high carbohydrate diet. So for me, it didn't work. But for other athletes out there, they might try it, and there might be a few of them that respond positively to it. And so you don't really know until you try. And that's really where I see the potential utility of this type of low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic version of the diet is among those, the small subset of individuals that respond positively to the diet. I don't really see a lot of utility of the diet in general for like large groups of endurance athletes. Again, there is the possibility that maybe for some ultra endurance athletes that are always training and racing at extremely low intensities, that this type of diet might have some performance benefit. But again, that research just hasn't been done. I think the real utility of this diet is for the small percentage of endurance athletes that just respond well to it. And that's kind of the overall conclusion that I'm coming to, is that for probably 95% of endurance athletes, high carbohydrate diet's going to work best. But for maybe 5% of endurance athletes, a low carbohydrate version of a diet might work best. Now, I do say this with some level of caution because there are some potential downsides to consuming a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And especially with a ketogenic diet, there are some potential long-term health risks with a ketogenic diet that we've seen in the research literature. And so that's not to necessarily be ignored. And then also just on lower carbohydrate diets in general, one thing that we have seen a little bit in the research literature is that it increases the risk of illness in endurance athletes, especially upper respiratory tract infections. And so there's just something about removing carbohydrates from the diet or drastically reducing carbohydrate intake in the diet that tends to have a negative effect on an athlete's immune system, especially when undergoing heavy training like most endurance athletes are undergoing. And so even among some of those athletes that see some type of performance benefit, they just will have to be aware of how it's impacting their health in general outside of athletic performance and training. Because even if they see a small improvement in their performance, it might not outweigh the negative effects that diet might have on their health, particularly their immune health. So just something else to consider as well with this type of diet. And yeah, that's essentially the take-homes that I got from reviewing the recent research literature that's been published on this topic. Again, if you are unfamiliar with this topic in general, I would suggest after listening to this podcast that you go back and read the couple articles that I've linked into the show notes. They're posts that I've written myself, but I go into much greater depth and detail as to some of the proposed mechanisms behind low carbohydrate diets. And then in especially the first post that I link in that I wrote back in 2016 or 17, I do a very, very comprehensive review of the research literature that had been done up to that point in time. So you'll get a much better sense of some of the mechanisms behind like why people think a low carbohydrate diet works for endurance athletes. And then most of the research that's been done to date, I kind of summarize in that post as well. So I would highly recommend that you go back and read those posts that I've linked into the show notes. But hopefully this podcast provided you with a good overview of some of the recent research that's been done on ketogenic low carbohydrate diets for endurance athletes. And hopefully it helps you be a little bit more informed when it comes to the dietary choices that you make as an endurance athlete yourself, or if you're a coach, hopefully you can be a little bit more informed on this topic when you encounter it with athletes that you're working with. And so, yeah, hopefully this podcast was enjoyable and interesting to you. Hope you got something out of it that you can walk away with and apply to yourself as an athlete or the athletes that you're working with as a coach. As always, if you have any questions on anything that I discussed within this podcast, feel free to reach out to me via email at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. And again, I'll link that mode of contact as well as other modes of contact into the show notes. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed listening to today's podcast, and I hope you will continue to join in for future podcast episodes. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The support is greatly appreciated. If you want to support the show a little bit more, I have set up a Patreon link, and I've included that Patreon link in the show notes. So if you feel like giving us a little bit of extra support, feel free to do so through Patreon. Also, feel free to give us a review or a star rating, depending on which platform you are listening on. Those reviews and the feedback is greatly appreciated. And then finally, if you know of someone who would be interested in our podcast show, feel free to share this episode or just the podcast in general with them, and that is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and thank you for supporting the show.